Hey everybody, welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing HTML forms and how we can start taking in user input. And then in the JavaScript crash course, we will revisit this topic and discuss how we can take that user input and send it all the way back to our servers. So to get started, we can create the form tag, and the form tag is a wrapper around all of our form inputs, or widgets as they are sometimes referred to. And to create an input, most of the time we will use the input tag, and this is a fairly generic tag that contains almost every type of input we could need, and we define what type of input we want using the type attribute. And here I'll go ahead and say that this is a text input, and we can close out this tag. It is a self-closing tag, and then we can save, and we will see that in the output we get this text box where I can go ahead and type, and it will work exactly as you would expect. But from here, we need a way to tell the user what they need to be typing here. What is this input? And we can do this using the label tag. Above the input, we'll go ahead and add one more tag, and this will be a label. And maybe this is a username. And then we can go ahead and save, and you see we get this username text to the left of the input. And with a username input, we should probably also have a password input. So let's go ahead and do that as well. I'll go ahead and create another label, call this one password. And then down below the password, we can create an input of, let's say, type equals password. And the password type works just like the text type, with the one difference being that when we type into the password input, it shows these black dots instead of showing the actual text. And this is nice because sometimes our users might be signing into a website from somewhere like a coffee shop or a public workplace, and they don't want everyone around them who can see their computer screen to also be able to see their passwords. Now, one thing you might notice when looking at our HTML is we have two different label tags, but those labels are just adjacent to other inputs, which makes it less clear what they are labeling. They're not surrounding any inputs. For example, this password label, is it a label for the input below it or a label for the input above it? And we know because they're both passwords that it's a label for the one below it, but that might not be clear to the browser that is just trying to understand our markup. And the way we can fix this is by adding one more attribute. So on the label tags, we will add a for attribute. And the for attribute says, what is this a label for? What is it connected to? And it takes in an ID. So we'll say this one is for username. And this ID needs to be a unique ID that exists one time on the page. And we can add that as an attribute to our input. So we can say ID equals username. And essentially what we're saying here is that this is the only element on the page that will have this identifier of username. And the label will then use that username to determine what it is labeling. And we can do the exact same thing for the password. So we can say this one is for password, and we can give this input an ID of password. And now when I save, you'll notice nothing actually changes in the output. It is the exact same. The only difference being that our HTML is marked up a little bit better, so it will work better for people using accessibility tools such as a screen reader. And from here, there are tons of different attributes that we could add to the inputs to customize them even more. But one in particular that I think is important is called the placeholder. So we can add a placeholder to this input. And what this placeholder does is it allows us to create some text that will show up in the text box, but slightly grayed out when there's no other text there, to give the user an idea of what type of text we are expecting. So maybe this will be user123. We'll go ahead and hit save. And you can see now in the output box, we have user123, but once I start typing, that will go away. And then when I backspace, user123 will come back. And now we need a way for the user to submit the form. We need them to be able to say they are done typing in their username and password and to send that data back to the server. And the way we do that is by adding a button to the bottom. So I'll go ahead and do that. And we can call this submit. Now, alternatively, we can also use an input tag for this with the type of submit. So we can say input type equals submit. And this will work the exact same way. Personally, I prefer the button tag because I think it looks a little bit nicer, but it's up to you. The one thing is just to make sure you are being consistent. Now, when a user clicks submit, we will send the data back to the server. However, that server isn't going to know what all of the data is. It's not going to know what user123 is, so we need to tell it that it is a username. So the way we do that is by adding one more attribute to the inputs, and we call this attribute name. So we can add a name attribute here, and we'll make this one password. And then we'll add a name attribute to the username as well. Name equals username. And just to make this a little bit easier to read, I'll go ahead and move all of these attributes onto their own lines, just to keep things nice and tidy. Okay, so now that we have that, when we go ahead and type in a username and password, so I'll make my username user and my password pass, and I hit submit, what we'll see is one, the form clears itself out, but second, in the URL, we also have the username and password that I typed in. Now you might be saying this isn't very helpful. Why would we want to send the username and password just to the URL? And this is the default behavior, but we can actually customize this using the form element itself. So on the form tag, we can add some attributes here. First being the action, and this says, where do we want to send this data? So maybe I want to send it to /myAPI, and then we can say, what method do we want to use? By default, this will be a GET request, which is going to send the value in the URL, but we could also change this to a POST request, which will say we want to send the values via the POST request body. And then again, we can go to JavaScript and customize this even more to get exactly what we want out of this form submit action. But for now, I'll go ahead and just remove these attributes, and we will revisit that again in the JavaScript crash course. Another thing you might have noticed is I was able to submit a password that was only 4 characters long. And this isn't great. We want our users to be submitting passwords that have more security to them than that. And we can do this with form validation. So each of the input tags can take different attributes that allow us to validate them or decide if the input the user has given us is a valid input for what we want. And if it's not valid, the form won't submit. So for example, on the password input, we can go ahead and add a minimum length of, let's say, 6. And this just says that this password needs to be at least 6 characters long. And I'll go ahead and move these attributes onto new lines as well, so that everything looks nice and clean and easy to read. And now when I go ahead and save and try to submit this again, so I'll do the exact same thing, user and pass, I'll hit submit, but it will give me this error message that my password needs to be a little bit longer. So I can go ahead and say pass12 now and hit submit, and that will work because now the password is fitting the criteria that we have set with minimum length. We can also add a required attribute, and the required attribute is a Boolean that just says that this field is required. So for example, I'll add required to the username input, go ahead and hit save. And now if I try to submit with no username, we'll get this error message that says, please fill out this field. So now I can say user, and it will let me submit without the password because the password doesn't currently have a required attribute. To fix this, I can go ahead and set the required attribute on the password as well. And one thing you'll notice here is that we are just setting the attributes using the name. This is because they're Boolean attributes. So if we just add the required text, it will set that to true. Alternatively, we can say required equals required, but personally, I prefer to just have the name. I think it looks a little bit cleaner. Up next, there are a few more types of inputs that we should look at that can be useful for a variety of situations. So let's go ahead and add another input tag. And this one we can say is going to be a type of date. And type of date allows a user to pick a date. We get a pretty nice UI here by default that makes it easy to type into. I'll put January 1st, 2025, and you can see it sort of autofills this in for me with the forward slashes in a nice readable format. And I can also click on this to open up this date picker UI, where I can pick a date through the actual calendar. Up next, let's go ahead and look at the checkbox input. So the checkbox input allows us to take in some user input of a Boolean value. So have they accepted the terms of service, for example, is probably the most common use case of checkboxes. And when you click this box, it simply sets its value to true. And when you click on it again, the check goes away, making the checkbox false. But sometimes we don't want to just take in one value like this. We want the user to have an option of, say, 3 values, and they have to pick one. And the way we can do that is using a radio button. So we'll change this type to radio, and radio buttons have a few more parameters they need. So first we have a name, and the name is going to be, in this case, the name of the group of radio buttons. So not just the name for this one input. So we can call this animal, for example, to make an input to choose an animal. And then we can go ahead and give this a value as well. And maybe this first one is going to be a dog input. And we can also go ahead and label this as dog. And we can say that this label is for our dog and give this input an ID of dog. Now we can copy this a few different times. That way we can create a few different radio buttons. And let's go ahead and go down to the second one and maybe change this to be cat. So this will be our cat input. Change the ID as well to match the for attribute, and we need to change the value. However, the name stays the same because this name represents the name for all of these radio buttons that are connected to each other. And on this last one, let's go ahead and change it as well. Let's make it horse, and we can change the for attribute, and we will also change the ID and the value. Now, if we save the HTML file, we will see that we have dog, cat, and horse. And of course, we could fix in CSS the fact that they are not all in one line. But what's cool about these is I can only select one at a time. So as I select them, it will move my selection rather than allowing me to multi-select. Now, if you look at the HTML for these radio buttons, you might notice that they are sort of semantically related to each other, but we have nothing connecting them in the HTML. And the way we usually do this is by adding a field set. So the field set is very similar to our semantic grouping tags. The only difference being that the field set is meant to contain form inputs and their labels. So now we can go ahead and take all of these labels and inputs and go ahead and move them inside of the field set. So this will be our field set for the radio buttons. Now, when I save this, you'll see the field set causes everything to move onto its own line, and it also gives us a border wrapping all of the inputs. But again, this is something we can change in CSS if we don't like it. And in each field set, in addition to the labels and inputs, we also usually add a title or a name for the field set. And the way we do this is with a tag called the legend. So I'll go ahead and add that here. We have legend, and inside of here, we give the name for the field set or whatever text we want associated with it. I'll say choose your animal. And when I save, you'll see this text sort of appears inside of that border of the field set. But again, we can always change this with CSS if we don't like it. And that's all there is to creating an HTML form. There are tons of other types of inputs and attributes we can use. We couldn't possibly go over every single one, but they all follow this same sort of syntax and formula. To give a quick recap, we create this form element, and this is going to wrap our entire form. And then each input of the form will be an input tag, as well as it will have a label associated with it using the for attribute, which is based on an ID attribute on the actual input. And then on these inputs, we give them a type to define what type of input we want. And finally, we need to also have this name parameter so that we can give a name to the input when we are sending it back to the server. Lastly, we saw the radio buttons work a little bit differently in that they all share a name because we only are sending one value back to the server for all three of these inputs. And that value will be which input did they select. And then we wrap these in a field set to semantically group the input tags together. And that field set will be named using the legend tag. And finally, at the end, we use the button tag or an input of type submit to create a submit button that will send that data back to the server. By default, this will just add it to the URL. But like we saw, we can change the attributes on the form tag to change that behavior. Or more likely, we can do that in JavaScript, as we'll see soon in the JavaScript crash course. And with that, I hope you found this video to be helpful. I'll see you in the next one.